Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my very special guest, Jed Hartley, former member of IHOP-KC. Jed, so good to have you on here. I've actually had people telling me that I had to have you on here for some time now, and we've tried to connect, so it's finally happening. And right now, as you can probably tell with the research on the website, all of my research into the background of IHOP-KC is exploding because I'm starting to learn that, I've studied all these different offshoots of Branhamism, and they're all they all kind of go their own way, and usually it's somebody who realizes that this thing is a scam, and so they want to scam people further, and it's usually a single man show. But I'm looking at this thing, and this is just so odd because it's like they literally tried to recreate the latter rain part of Branhamism and pulled out all of the very bad aspects and ran with the bad stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as someone who's been reading a bunch of your work and just on the history before IHOP-KC and like the history of the movement of where I came from, I've been learning sort of the same thing of just seeing the same threads of like, oh, this person taught this same, Joel's Army stuff, like that, like all of the key phrases. It's interesting to sort of follow the line and see the different iterations of this that's been in the past. So I really appreciate your research that you've done and having me on here. I'm super excited to be on here to talk with you about all of it.
Awesome. Yeah, when you start to realize the trails of history and where they lead, and whenever these guys tell you about their trails of history and their religious past and the people that built the platforms that they stand on, they paint them with this great picture. So you're thinking these are great holy men, and you start peeling up the rocks and looking under the rocks of what these guys were standing for, and oh my gosh, man. And you've done some of this, right? You've been digging into some of these guys.
Because I've been trying to find a way to articulate it, but essentially you have these heroes of the faith, or at least individuals who I grew up considering heroes of the faith, who had these really, frankly, horrific pasts of just using, not just like separate from their ministries or separate from their prophetic, giftings. They used a lot of their ministry and giftings to abuse, coerce, grift, get whether money, whatever they were after. There was a lot of this continual pattern of people abusing power, and it's just so interesting to hear or to think about how I was taught about those individuals. And it's, if they could do a miracle, all of the negative things in their past suddenly disappeared, right? If they could heal the sick, if they could prophesy, if they, that was all that was talked about. It was just talked about Wigglesworth's, ability to heal the sick. And it was just talked about, Branham's ability to heal the sick. And didn't hear about their association with the KKK, didn't hear about their serpent seed doctrines, didn't hear about, these things. Although some of those doctrines at different times would come up in conversations it's uncanny, because I hear a lot of the things that you've been producing, read a lot about the previous individuals who've kind of led to IHOP-KC, and all of it is familiar. All of it seems like it's never what I was taught explicitly, but it all is familiar because it's just a reiteration of the same thing. At least that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah. History repeating itself.
Yeah.
The other thing that's funny, I love history anyway, so all of this kind of fits me, but the world we live in today is so much different than the world that existed in the days gone by. And people today, it's not that they're smarter, but they have a lot more street smarts. They're not going to be fooled as easy as somebody back in the day, right? But then compound that with the fact that humans are complex. We were manipulated to think it's good versus evil. You're either good or you're bad. But there are bad people that do good things and good people that, there's this mix, right? I was reading years ago, I want to say I was maybe 16, I was reading some studies on Jesse James, and here's this outlaw, but yet people loved him because he was kind of a great guy. He just did some bad things, and he's not a person you'd want to model your life after, but that's the way it is. People are like this. But these religious figures, what they have done is they have taken, and it seems like the worst of the worst because I examine the bad side, but they've taken only the good and brought it forward and said, these people did all of these good things. And they don't tell you the people problems that they had. Some of them were just outright scoundrels. Dowie was a con artist from start to finish, right? They don't tell you that part. Some of the men that I examine, they did bad things, and some of them had maybe good intentions to start with. But if you don't bring that balance to the people, you're really telling only the side of the story that suits your agenda, and then you make yourself look worse when people find out. Yeah, because you've hidden all of these things. I find the same goes for just testimonies, not even of the heroes, but just of the community and culture in general. So I grew up at IHOP-KC. My dad was instrumental in the foundation of it. Like, he actually owned the building that the first International House of Prayer was. So like, I grew up living in the House of Prayer and running around, and a lot of my formative years were spent there when IHOP was just getting started. But I've also been involved with Bethel and with YWAM, and throughout all of these, like, the way that testimonies are handled, and it's not even, I wouldn't even call it insidious or anything like that, but there's just this propensity to always tell the good testimonies, always tell the times people were healed, the prophecies that were accurate. And it's very exhausting for if you grow up in there or if you live in there for several, decades or whatever, because you see a lot of the, hey, we prayed for this person, they didn't get healed, and then they died. We prayed for a young child to be raised from the dead, and she didn't. And the way that I have some memories of experiences when I fully believed in healing, believed in prophecy, believed in all of it, and yet I would see things. We would seem to have all the faith in the world, and yet the prophecy wouldn't come true, or someone wouldn't get healed. And when you wanted to talk about it, no one was talking about it, because it's only the testimonies of the good and not the testimonies of the bad. So they created this false world that didn't exist. And then eventually, I grew up old enough and was like, hey, this just isn't real, I look back at some of the things. I believed all of this hook, line, and sinker, but I was there whenever some of these things, before they came to fruition. And I'm just going to throw generic examples because I don't want to call out names, but you've got a guy who claims that he's a prophet, and he goes into this place, like say he goes to Los Angeles and says, and I see that God has told me there's going to be an earthquake and a building will fall. And this is a place where there's hundreds of earthquakes per year, right? Yeah. And so when a building falls, then people say, oh, that's because that prophecy. The guy doesn't even have to be a prophet to make this, right? But the way it works to the people that are being indoctrinated, it enters into a mythology, because the person who is supportive of said prophet will take the people to this building that fell, whether it was part of the prophecy or not, and say, look, here is the fulfillment of the prophecy. And then as it enters legend, they'll say, and this guy predicted that building would fall, because they're connecting all of the dots. Well, towards the end of it, everybody has connected all of the dots, and they don't really think about the vague thing that was initially said that could mean anything, right? And that's a bad example. I've seen, I've seen this happen multiple times, but also with the healings, this person's going to get better. We've prayed to God that they're going to get better. Well, if they do get better, they claim that it was because of the prayer and not, they've distracted the focus from it's because God healed them, or sometimes it's just because they decided to start taking their meds again,
Right. Yeah.
There's so many plausible explanations for a lot of it.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I respect you not wanting to name names. I have no problem naming some names too, but you let me know if I should be more, keep more anonymity of this. But I mean, so my father, Bob Hartley, is a prophetic figure, and was a very prominent prophetic figure in the IHOP, Bethel, YWAM world. And he would go, and I would travel with him. So I saw the behind the scenes of how this sort of prophetic, frankly, this prophetic grift would work. There are different types of how different prophets speak, just like you're saying, like someone goes into a place that has a lot of earthquakes and says there's going to be a great shaking, and then 2 months later, there's an earthquake, and it's lo and behold, and it's like, well, this is Los Angeles. We get earthquakes all the time, But Bob Jones was a little bit like that. Bob Jones would just say a bunch of random things, and you never really understood. It was always very. When I was young, it felt mysterious. It felt very intriguing because he was speaking in riddles and stuff like that, but he would just frankly throw stuff up against the wall and see what would stick, and then had so many people who absolutely adored him that people would pick out things and remember and detail everything and then say, oh, look, Bob Jones prophesied this. And it's like, well, he prophesied 40 different things during that time. There's a instance where Bob Jones went into a church and he started prophesying that there was going to be deaths in the community. I don't know if you've read or written about this at all. It was in do you know the Ernie Gruen report on Bob Jones?
Yeah.
So this was in that report about him. But so during I think there's early 80s, he's traveling with Mike Bickle, and this is when all of the prophecy about the International House of Prayer is starting to take shape and take form. Like, this is the time in which all of these, the birthing place of these movements is happening. And it was very much the critical figures in that were really Mike Bickle and Bob Jones, and Paul Cain to some extent, but mainly Mike Bickle and Bob Jones. And Bob Jones is going to these different churches. And so he goes into this one church, and there had just been a young couple in that community had died in a motorcycle accident. And he used that as like a example of God releasing his judgment, and talked about how like he prophesied that there was going to be more deaths if this church didn't turn towards him. And then later he, 5 years later, him and Mike Bickle were talking about it, and they kind of gave this testimony of, I prophesied that there was going to be deaths at this church. There were a bunch of deaths that happened, and they didn't turn from the Lord. And then you get the testimony of the pastor who's like, no, first of all, Bob Jones didn't prophesy that the two young children, or the two who died on the motorcycle, he didn't prophesy. He came after they had already died. And then he prophesied, and we're a congregation, and we have some old people in our congregation, and a few people passed away. That's not unusual or whatever. And so I remember reading about that when I was like a long time ago, when I was like 15, I got a hold of the Earning Gruen report. And that was the first time I was like, hey, some of these things look like they don't add up. First of all, why are you prophesying death at all? That's just not, can't at all think of a good reason why you would want to do that. So Bob Jones had that tendency to kind of tell the story one way and then fill in the details to make it seem much more miraculous afterwards. And when in reality, it wasn't miraculous at all. It wasn't,
You mentioned, why are you prophesying this anyway? And that's one of the things that hit me whenever we left the movement that we were in. Most of the prophecies weren't intended to help the people or even give them spiritual guidance. It was more to make them realize that the Joker was a prophet. So what's the purpose of this, right? Why would God do this? Why would God pick up this man, right? So I wrestled with that for a long time, and people don't know this. When I first left this, I still thought William Branham was a prophet. I thought one of the prophecies had failed, and we have been manipulated in such a way that we didn't care if there was a failure. Yet the Bible, it's a one strike and you're out kind of deal for a prophet. Either you're a fraud or you're not a fraud. And so none of it really hit me, but the thing that did hit me was, why would I care about some of these things? And so I began to examine the movements that spawned off of this, and I find that there's so many people that just clone that. And in fact, there was here it's in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It's about, I want to say it's like 30 minutes south of here. They had a school of the prophets where this Joker was teaching people how to do this. And it's exactly like you said, all these vague sayings. They'll use metaphors a lot. Basically, they're saying a lot of words to see what sticks. And they themselves won't even claim that it's a prophecy in most cases, because if it fails, they're bound to it. But the people listening will hear it and they'll pick up and they'll say, oh, well, that green light that you saw, that looks exactly like this light over here, whatever it is. They take something that's very vague and pick it and run with it and say that was a prophecy. And I'm leading up to a point. All of this to say, as I began reading through the transcripts of Branham and how he was training these other guys to become quote-unquote prophets, there's one statement that hit me. He said, I never said I was a prophet. You, the people, said this. And then it suddenly clicked what's going on. They're just, like you said, they're throwing things out there, throw darts to see what sticks. But they themselves aren't even producing a real prophecy. They're just producing a lot of words that people will think are prophecies, and then they call them prophets.
Yeah. The Branham saying, well, I never called myself a prophet, hits home so much to me, because all Bob Jones, Mike Bickle, and Bob Hartley, I mean, those were the three who I obviously grew up, one being my literal father and the other two being my spiritual fathers, all have had some similar defenses of themselves, of being like, no, I'm not, I never called myself a prophet. Like Mike Bickle has talked about the Kansas City prophets, and he's like, we didn't give ourselves that name. Someone else gave us that name. And meanwhile, it's so gaslighting, because I grew up going to prophetic conferences. Like they were called prophetic conferences. Like I was in the and where my dad would be like, okay, we're going to go into a prophetic time, like it's so bizarre, because these men were operating within this sort of prophetic authority, and oftentimes too would label themselves prophetic, and say, maybe they wouldn't be like, I'm a prophet, but they would be like, well, my prophetic gifting or whatever. But again, we would go to prophetic conferences. Like the conference was called Hearing God's Heart Prophetic Conference, and it's like, it's so bizarre to then have the defenses be like, well, I never really called myself a prophet. And it's like, my entire childhood was that entire thing. But with my dad specifically, and some other major contemporary prophets, there's more than just the, say, vague, large prophecies and that, or very generic, sort of like cold reading, and you go to a psychic or something like that, and they're like, I see someone in your life who is sick and that they need healing and stuff, and you're like, okay, well, everybody has a sick family member or whatnot. There is also a pattern in the community that I was raised in, where there would be information that they would get from non-divine means. In the last, 10, 15 years, it's been primarily through, we now have Facebook and Instagram and have a wealth of information about specific individuals. All you need is their name. And then, if I have your name, I can look you up and I can find all the books that you have written, and I can find your publisher, and I can find the name of, your editor or whoever. And then if I'm prophesying to you, I can say, I actually haven't done this, so I don't know what your editor's name is, but, I could say, I see another John in your life who is helping you do these things, and, give a specific word where you're like, oh, this isn't generic now. This is very specific, and like, oh, God must be actually speaking to this person. And I can't with total certainty speak of the prevalence of this in, a great number of the prophetic individuals, but I know that was what my dad did. And my dad would do, he would get a lot of information. He would use me and my sisters sometimes when we were young to do research about people before these prophetic conferences. And we would get a list of names of everybody who's coming to the prophetic conference. And so we would get some information, and we just thought that we were helping him when we were young. We didn't realize that we were doing anything wrong. It felt kind of icky, but we're kids. We didn't know. And we would put him on he would bring in these big notebooks, and he would go then to the pastors of the community, and he would ask questions to the pastors, and he'd be like, tell me about your worship leader. And they would give him specific information. They would be like, oh, well, our worship leader's name is Craig, and he just got in a big car accident or something like that. And we've been praying for him, and his wife is in the hospital because of this. And he would just write down right in front of the pastor, just write down that information. And he had a pretty good memory and could recall, and he had a flair for the dramatic too. And so when he would prophesy, he would have his notebooks there, and then he would call it out. He would sometimes call their phone numbers out, and work that into a prophecy somehow. You're the 813 man, your Psalms 813. Does the number 813 mean anything to you? And they're like, oh, that's the last 3 digits of my phone number, or that's my street address or something like that. And so it was like that. It was the next step up from going from that large sort of cold reading or these grand, prophecies about the, future of America, and that are kind of big and like what Bob Jones would do. It got into the way more specific stuff about people with very specific information. I've probably seen, literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of people be moved by prophecies that my dad, he would go to these conferences, and it would be 10, 15 people, and every single night it would just be a line of people in and out. And we would go to the leaders. The leader of YWAM, Lauren Cunningham, he prophesied to Lauren Cunningham. We were really close with Lauren Cunningham. We were really close to Bill Johnson. We were really close to Cheon of H-Rock, really close to Rick Joyner of Morningstar. And he would prophesy to all of these different leaders. And when I got older, I was like, uh-oh, Dad, they're going to find you out. Like, this isn't going to work, you know? And I was so concerned for him because I thought he was the fraud in the midst of a lot of honest people. And that was very difficult for me to deal with my own father. And like, I knew it was wrong and I wanted him to change, and he would promise me that he would stop doing it and stuff like that. And he would just tell stories and not do prophecy and whatnot. But then even in the last year, there's a lot of the scandal with Mike Bickle came out. There was a lot of information that came out about my own father, and I'm not sure how much you know about all of this stuff, but basically just everything hit the fan within this last year. And I've been talking with different religious leaders in this community and trying to inform them, hey, this really was going on. It was a grift. Like, it was not genuine, and it's dangerous now. Now we see that these men were not just using it to, you know, trick people and boost their conference numbers. They were using it to sexually exploit, you know, young and vulnerable people. And this is a dangerous thing. Like, this is criminally dangerous. And spoke with a bunch of leaders, and I have just been absolutely shocked by how little they care. Like, it just wasn't a big revelation to a lot of people that, you know, either they don't believe me, or a lot of them do believe me. And it's just like, well, I'm so hungry for what God is doing, I'm not going to focus on what God is not doing. And it's like, how does this not corrupt everything? You just let people come into your midst and use outright deception. You have to fight against that. And like, this doesn't seem like this is the first time you're hearing about some of this. So how many of the prophetic individuals in the past were also doing the same thing? And, you know, I feel for me and for other, especially young adults who either grow up or get kind of grafted into those communities at a young age. I mean, you hear all these good testimonies. It goes back to like hearing all the positive testimonies, hearing, oh my goodness, Bob Hartley gave this prophetic word that absolutely no one possibly could have known. And you change your entire view of the world based off of this information that is just explicitly false, not even, you know, gray area. Like, this is explicit lies. And you let so many people in the community build their faith off of these explicit lies. It is inherently deceptive, and
it's awful. You know, the one thing that I've learned about con artists is that they like to surround themselves with other con artists. Because if they surround themselves with people who have moral code and moral values, they're going to figure them out, and then they're suddenly going to separate. And so they're going to lose the people closest to them. So they like to gather, you know, birds of a feather flock together, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I have a hard time. In fact, I've got emails in my inbox today talking about some of these IHOP guys and people connected to IHOP. And they want to say, yes, this was bad, but let's defend figure A because he was in the group and you can't single him out because these other guys were bad. Well, they all knew, man. If you work with these guys long enough, you know the bad ones. You know that you're in a set of bad apples. And then you have the moral decision. Do I continue with the bad people if I'm a good person, or do I leave? And those that stay are clearly, at least in my opinion, these are not good people if they knowingly stay. So you've got that going on. But then at the same time, they kind of lift each other up. So when one is about to fall, they either create their own prophetic versions of whatever is the agenda for the group to make it less impactful whenever something goes bad. And I see a lot of that going on, not just in IHOP, but many of these movements that spring up from Branhamism. You've got leaders who are maybe not even in the same ministries, but they're kind of networked. together. And
Yeah.
honestly, that's what drove me to studying the NAR as a whole, because once I realized that it's this labyrinth of networks of men who, many of which are con artists, helping other con artists to survive, then suddenly it becomes like, this is the criminal underworld, man. This is not religion. What is this mess? And it just fascinates me to no end.
100%. I was talking with a good friend of mine when some of this first, sort of the first wave of the revelations on Mike Bickle and his sexual assault, and just that whole scandal when that was first breaking. I remember talking with my friend and being like, was this like the mafia? Like, was this less of a church organization and more of like a crime family? Because you just, basically what happened during that time, I started looking into how previous scandals had been handled. So same thing with Bob Jones and Paul Cain, both had their sexual scandals where they were using prophecy for, to exploit young, vulnerable people. And seeing how Mike Bickle handled Bob Jones' scandal, and seeing how Bob Hartley handled Bob Jones' scandal, and all of these different things. It's like they really are just protecting each other. And when, I don't know if you've read, I'm trying to find more information on this, but when Paul Cain was confronted about his sexual sin, there's been mention, like my dad has mentioned it. I haven't been able to find like good research on it, but apparently in this meeting, Paul Cain went off and was like, if you come after me, I'm coming after all of you. And he pointed at the other big, very prominent NAR figures in that time and was like, I have dirt on all of you. And I remember my dad telling me about that incident, and I've been wanting to find out, well, was it successful? Like, was he able to successfully manipulate those individuals? Like, there's so much gray, so there's just this veil over all of the behind the scenes dealings. So it's really hard to understand. Did he actually have information about each one of them? Did he then successfully use that to his own advantage? What was the fallout from that? What was he talking about? Did he know about Mike Bickle's, what was going on? Because some of the stuff that we found out about Mike Bickle was going on back at that time. And so...
Paul Cain was the fixer, and he was trained under Branhamism. And although I wasn't there, I can't speak to that event. But what I can say, in the Branham cults, the ministers all have dirt on each other. In fact, I have sat through sermons where the minister goes off against one of the other ministers and says, and I've got a file in my cabinet in that office, and he starts talking about all the dirt that he has on the guys. That's the way it is. In the podcast that I do with Charles Paisley, he goes into that a bit because he got access to one of those file cabinets, so he knows specifically the dirt that was in there. And I've had high-ranking members of some of the offshoots tell me that their cult leaders, they had access to their file cabinets. So it's not just one or two. This was a widespread thing. And the fact that Paul Cain came from Branhamism, he would have been trained to do this. They apparently all trained each other to be, if one falls, then you've got 100 fixers, because everybody's got dirt on everybody. And what it does, it's like a den of thieves, man. If you all know that you're all thieves and you've all got all the dirt to confront one of them, if anyone steps out of line, you just raise the risk of the thief getting caught. And that's essentially what's happening here. But Paul Cain, I mentioned he called me a few times whenever I started publishing all the Klan stuff. That's when he began contacting me. And they were trying to dig into trying to dig into I think they're trying to fix me, basically.
Yeah.
But they're trying to dig, and I knew a little bit about Paul Cain, but not a lot. And like I do these podcasts, I've got monitors everywhere. So as I'm talking to this guy on the phone, I'm pulling up, who is Paul Cain? What do I know about him? What can I see? And oh my gosh, that was the first time I came across the allegations of him molesting small boys, and then I dove into that deeper to find his apology, and so he was trying to dig into me, and so I threw him off guard by asking if he knew asking his opinion of what happened and what they were talking about. And he denied the whole thing, and as he's denying it, I've got his apology for it right here on my screen. And so that's the type of mentality of these guys. If they don't think that you know the facts, they'll deny the facts until you know the facts, and then they'll call the fixer, and the fixer comes in and makes everything better. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
Yeah, that rings so true with many of my own experiences of, even in the last year, of trying to call out certain, I spoke with one of the leaders of IHOP during this whole Mike Bickle saga. I spoke with the interim pastor, and someone who I had grown up grown up with. I mean, he's 15 years older than me or something, but I grew up with him and his family, and I called him and I was like, hey, a lot of people are saying what is going on with Mike Bickle isn't true, that these accusations are false and whatnot. And I just want to let you know, they're absolutely true. Like, my dad confirmed some of this from back in 1983 of some of his early knowing about that. Mike Bickle had, I don't know how much you've gotten into it yet or not, but Mike Bickle was regularly prophesying to different young women, very young women, that his own wife, Diane Bickle, was going to die. And the prophetic message was that when Diane died, which he believed was going to happen in an earthquake in St. Louis, a place that doesn't have a whole lot of earthquakes and hasn't had. So that one, he missed on that one. So he prophesied that she was gonna die, and that these young women, when she died, that they would then have a place to pursue a relationship with him. And then he kind of groomed them, using that as the sort of excuse to condone why a man who's married with 2 children can develop this sort of relationship with a young woman. If you're familiar with Mike Bickle's teaching, very similar to his prepare the bridegroom teachings about preparing the bride for the return of the king. Very similar reasoning of, let me prepare this young woman for when my wife is going to die, and it'll open up a door for us to have a relationship. So anyway, I knew about that instance for quite a while. My father knew about it because one of the core women who have come forward about Mike Bickle, who was one of the victims of this, was very close to my family, and she is still remaining anonymous right now. But I knew from her, and I knew from my dad too, before even any of these accusations came about. I knew of that story. So when the accusations came about and there was other women saying the same thing, I have absolute certainty that this happened, that there was no way that they were talking to each other. These accusations, independently, 3 women all saying the same story that is very specific and very bizarre without talking with each other, you can just know it's true. Plus they were very, these women are very honest individuals, very well-respected individuals. They're not lying. They're not trying to conspire to bring down Mike Bickle. And so anyway, when all of that information came about, I called up the leader of, or the de facto pastor at the time of IHOP-KC, and I was talking to him about it, and he acted like he didn't know any of it. He didn't know about Bob Jones. I told him, hey, Bob Jones did something similar where young women, he used prophecy to get them into a vulnerable position and sexually assault them. That's the same case with him. And I don't know if he, and that's that really frustrating thing where they just play ignorant about it, either about their own, no, that didn't happen, or no, I've never heard about it, I didn't know. And it's just this very confusing situation where you don't know if you're being gaslit the entire time. And there's just this pattern of people can be able to deny it, and there's no proof. There's no, that never happened. You don't know this. And then when you do have all of the information, they pretend like they didn't know it, or it was something different. And it's just so, frankly, insidious. It's just bizarre, and it's hard to have any accountability in a community where there just is no clarity on what is happening behind the scenes. And there's no one who's trying to bring clarity. They are all in it together to try to try to, that one. I'm a writer, not a speaker,
I get what you're saying.
It's they're trying to keep everything unclear. And so to be able to cut through there and bring any sense of clarity or certainty is a near impossible task. And then if you do, you totally get exiled from the community. You're labeled a backslider or whatever it is. And
yeah, I'm fascinated with studies and books and even fiction of criminal minds. In fact, there's a show, Criminal Minds, which is a great show if you've seen it. But I like to see how those people think, because it's not the way that the rest of us think. And why do they do the things that they do? I'm fascinated by this. But one of the things that you find, especially in the organized crime, organized crime is just simply there's an organization and there's a hierarchy of the criminals. And the guy at the top likes a middle tier of people that he has dirt on. And so I look at the structure for the criminal minds and organized crime, and I look at this, and I can't say that this is the mob, maybe it's the Christian mafia if you want to call it that, but the structure is so similar because the guys at the top knew the dirt on the other guys. And I think that's why they chose them, because it's easier to control a guy that you've got dirt on, or a girl that you've got dirt on.
Yeah.
But so these guys purposefully chose people that they could control and manipulate. And if one steps out of line, well, it's blackmail. I'm going to release all of your dirty laundry is going to the public. But then, they twist also the biblical mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. That no longer matters in these groups, because now you've got these 2 or 3 witnesses who say that they've been abused by Mike Bickle. Well, that's the biblical mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. But you find that the whole group that's staying in it, they're totally ignoring the biblical mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, because they've been manipulated to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have, I mean, the Bible, I have never seen biblical principles ever used to hold leaders accountable. I've only seen biblical principles used to help um, get them away from any sense of accountability. You know, there's the whole Matthew 18 process of the way that you need to, if you want to confront a leader, you first, honestly, I don't even know what it is anymore, because it never made sense to me, even when I was within the world, and it still doesn't make sense to me. But it's this process in which, hey, there's a biblical way to go about correcting a leader who has sinned against you. And surprise, surprise, it involves going to that very leader and other leaders. It's not going outside. It's not if going to the police, if that's necessary, you know. And it provides them with an opportunity to control the situation. If you have an entire community who are beholden to this Matthew 18 process where they have to go back to the leader in order to address any, you know, wrongdoing, they can't go public, they can't, you know, talk to the police, they can't talk to other pastors of other communities or something like that. You have built in this sort of fail-safe process that you will always be able to know and anticipate when a scandal is coming, because the entire community is always going to feed it back through the channels. And then, like you said, okay, well, now we do have biblical principles of like, they went through the Matthew 18 process. All of this has been, you know, done according to the way that you're supposed to do it. And there's the more, you know, 2 or 3 witnesses. There's so much. You could look at the Bible and give so much precedent for correcting, or not more than just correcting, for exposing and addressing the abuse of Mike Bickle, and yet it's just not happening. And still to this day, IHOP-KC has like not investigated. It absolutely baffles me what they're doing. I mean, it's just completely bizarre. There's just no accountability. And they're slowly like dying as a church, and they're going to get smaller and smaller, and eventually it's just going to become not a thing anymore, because it's kind of like go down with the ship sort of situation. There's a hole in the ship, and instead of trying to fix it, trying to address, okay, what was Mike Bickle doing? What is the prophetic history? Have we been manipulated by some of this prophetic history doing all of this? What is the truth? You know, they're like, this is too big of a hole. We can't fix it. So might as well just sink and pretend like it didn't happen, while telling their community to not get on Facebook, not get on Twitter, to not look at these things. Like, everybody just look at me and we'll all sink together, sort of thing. And it's very sad too, because as much as I really do believe that many of these leaders are some sinister people, the community members, I like a lot of my friends and family members that I grew up with, genuine people who really believed, you know, I really believe that there's a lot of like good-hearted, compassionate people within these communities who just believed everything that their leaders were saying, and really thought that they were part of the end times church, and that they were helping ushering in God's final kingdom, that they were a part of, you know, a healing revival that was going to sweep the land, that they were a part of this young Joel's generation, this Joel's army of people who are going to be blessed 10 times more than that which happened in Acts, where they were going to have gifts of the Spirit of healing and prophecy. And what Mike Bickle and Bob Jones and Bob Hartley did, we were going to do 10 times more. Like, I understand the appeal. I mean, I was in it. Like, that's what I felt, even into my mid-20s. You know, I thought that was going to be my future in my life. And so I just feel so bad for the people who are currently at IHOP, who are being told not to look, you know, not to that everything's okay around them while the burning or the building burns or the ship is sinking. They are just told it's all good, that this is just a tax from Satan, and we're still on the straight and narrow. We're still doing the good things. And it's pretty tragic.
Yeah, these guys, they like to go down with a sinking ship because that's the ship that made them all the money, basically.
Right.
There's no question about it. And what's really odd to me is, the fact it's not just that they tried to recreate a new revival or new passion for Christianity or anything like this. They literally tried to clone Latter Rain, which had already been denounced as heresy by many Christian leaders. It's like they chose the worst possible thing to recreate and said, let's recreate this. But then they didn't tell anybody that where it came from. Like all of the people I've talked with at IHOP, nobody had a clue that this came from the Latter Rain, and it was rebirthing Latter Rain revival.
I have felt the same thing. I knew about it because I traveled with my dad with Bob Jones, and Bob Jones has he was more explicit. Like, Bob Jones wasn't trying to repackage and rebrand. He was just pretty straightforward, Latter Rain, talking about all of those different things. So, I remember hearing about and gleaning some of this. And even when I've been talking to some individuals who went to IHOP's School of Ministry, I've talked with them now, and they're like, oh, no, we didn't actually have involvement with Latter Rain. And I was like, that is just not true. That's just Mike Bickle picked Bob Jones to be that sort of prophetic visionary because of a lot of the Latter Rain ideology, which I agree with you. If you're picking something, I don't know why you would pick that. Pick something that hasn't been just recently exposed as fraudulent and sinister. But
the only thing I can think of is that was the first. You look at what Dowie did, and Dowie made a heck of a lot of money for his day. But you look at what Latter Rain created, and it was a platform for people like Dowie to make money. They were basically generating a new platform where lots of men could join in. And the argument, it wasn't like Latter Rain. Well, you chose Paul Cain. He's the direct connection to he's Branham's protege, man.
Yeah,
definitely recreating Latter Rain. But the whole thing is just so odd, and having experienced myself, it really messes you up when you're in this type of religion. It's not at all Christianity, but you're told that it is. And the God that you're given is like a rabbit's foot God. Rub it a little bit and we'll give you a healing, or rub it a little bit, we'll give you a money, or whatever it is. And the whole thing is just, it's awful. It wreaks havoc on the lives. If you could say one thing to encourage the people that have been in this and have went through the horrors of IHOP-KC, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, for people who, if you've done the hard work of just allowing yourself to ask the questions, which, I mean, that's always the first step of it. There's that terrible, awful feeling in the back of your head, or thought in the back of your head of, hey, what if these men aren't prophets? What if these aren't men inspired by God? Or what if, there is a lot of sinister stuff going on behind the scenes. I have seen in my own life, and in a lot of others who are close to me, I've seen that's that huge first step. Just being able to kind of recognize and allow yourself to ask questions of that community. And then once you do that, it takes time, but I've seen so many people, their lives have totally turned around, because at the end of the day, it's not a good gospel. It's not none of it's, you don't want any of it to be true. It's intense. It's, sure, there might be healings, but at the same time, there's a lot of fear, a lot of hatred, a lot of, guilt and shame especially like at places like the International House of Prayer, where if you don't get healed, then it's your fault. It's you did something wrong. And so I've seen so many people, my life and my sister's and my mother's life included, like, where once you got out of the wilderness, once you got out of that sort of terrifying, whatever it is that kept you in there to begin with, once you were able to sort of step out, there's so much freedom on the other end. There's so much, self-worth. There's so much curiosity. There's so much to be discovered and found once you're on the other side. It's just really difficult getting there. Like, it's going to be a process, and it'll take some time, but it's worth it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, the early Christians, as they were experiencing the freedom of not being under the Mosaic law, they were like, it's free, the burdens are lifting. What you're describing is what they felt. And the word gospel just simply means good news. It's the good news that you can have this freedom. But what these guys taught was the antithesis of this. So it was literally the bad news. The bad news is coming, and therefore get in with us. And so you can really say that it was the direct opposite of the gospel. It was the bad news that this group was bringing. But thank you so much for doing this with us. I know that there's a lot of people wanting to hear more from you and more about the insights of somebody who, grew up in this thing and was close to the leadership. So thank you for doing this. Yeah,
my pleasure. Anytime. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more about the dark side of the NAR, read Weaponized Religion, From Christian Identity to the NAR, available on Amazon, Kindle, and soon Audible.